All right. Welcome back, everybody. I hope, again, everyone's doing well. It's week 12 or 13 or 14. Who knows? Somewhere in there. But we're getting close. I'm running out of PowerPoints, and that's a good sign, I think, for everybody. So we're going to today continue on talking about birds, class Aves. And remember that I pointed out before that birds really are a type of dinosaur, the Saurischian type of dinosaur. So they survived the Cretaceous extinction 65 million years ago. They were descendants of these small dinosaurs that made it through and are alive now. So when we talk about birds, the most probably obvious thing that people notice about birds is that they can fly. So since birds are capable, and one of the few groups that are truly capable of flight in sort of every kind of way, there are a couple of birds that don't fly, but those are far and few between. Most birds fly. Because of the flight, there's a great deal of adaptations that go along with being able to fly. Flying is a very different kind of motion than being on the ground or swimming through the water. So we see a lot of adaptations related to flight. First of all, birds have hollow bones. Now, what that means is that in a typical mammal bone, let's say, you would have a piece of bone like that, and you might even in a mammal bone have a space, which is like where the bone marrow is. But this part of the bone would be solid bone, okay? Solid laid down bone material. And it would be very dense and it would be very heavy and very strong. Birds, on the other hand, if you were to take a bird bone, and let's say you take the same kind of bone where it also has maybe bone marrow in the middle. So we're not talking about the center of the bone like in your arm or your leg, which will be hollow in both of them because there's a blood supply and tissue in there. We're talking more about the edges of the bone. What you'll find in a bird is that instead of it being solid, you'll have these sort of, it'll be like plates, like struts, and they will travel through like this. And so there'll be bone in there, but there'll be all these little gaps. And what that does is it makes the bird bone still pretty strong because of the struts that are going different directions and supporting it, but it makes it a lot lighter. So birds, relative to the same size as the animal, such as a mammal, are much, much lighter. Okay. Birds also have feathers. That's a unique characteristic to birds. And they have wings, and their wings are modifications of their front forelimb. So they still have the same basic structures of the bones, but they're modified as a wing. So the front arm of a bird is the same structure essentially as a human arm, has the same basic bones, humerus, ulna, and some modifications that go along with those to turn it into a wing. They are endothermic, which means they rely on their own metabolism to generate their own body heat. They have reduced organs. For example, they'll be missing an ovary, and they're missing a urinary bladder. They're missing teeth, so they'll have a beak without teeth. And all those things make them lighter. Getting rid of the urinary bladder, getting rid of an extra ovary, losing the teeth, all of those things make the bird a lighter animal. Now, what we notice back in the fossil record, the origin of birds, one of the most famous fossils of all time is this one here, Archaeopteryx. And you should know that one, Archaeopteryx. That is a very primitive ancestor to the birds, and people debate whether it could fly or not. Probably it could not fly, but rather it could probably glide. It definitely has feathers. on it. It has a beak with teeth on it, so that's kind of a reptile thing. It has a long tail as well, which is very much a reptile thing. So birds don't usually have a long bony tail like you see here. So those are reptile sort of characteristics, but it definitely has feathers. And so one of the things that we think happened in evolutionary history is feathers evolved first and probably were not used for flight right away. Their first evolutionary value was probably for keeping them warm, by keeping the bird warm. So an endothermic animal is trying to trap its own body heat. The feathers probably helped with that, and then later on evolved into using them for flight, because we believe birds early on probably did not fly, the ancestors of the birds. Since Archaeopteryx was found, there's been other fossils found in parts of China. Synoptics is one fossil, and Caudopteryx is another. So there's other fossils that we found of bird ancestors that evolutionarily are older than Archaeopteryx, and suggest also the same idea that feathers probably were around on a small running kind of dinosaur at first, and probably were used for warmth. There are different kinds of feathers. Feathers are made out of a protein called keratin, which is the same thing that makes up your hair and your fingernails. And so there are contour feathers that are used for body coverings. And you can see contour feather there covering the body of the bird. There's obviously flight feathers, which are used for flight. They are long, they're tapered, and they act as an airfoil. They trap air so that it can't go through the feather, but rather it pushes the air in a certain way, and birds can manipulate their wing and therefore these flight feathers to generate lift. They have also, in addition to flight feathers, they have down feathers. You might have heard of down feathers before. If you have a down sleeping bag or a down jacket, they tend to be very, very warm, and the down feathers are used for warmth. And they're one of the best insulators that we know of in nature. You can buy a synthetically made down sleeping bag that, unless you spend a lot of money, isn't as good usually as the down feathers themselves. So down feathers, we're getting better at making something that's better than what you find in nature, but it's taken a long time. So those down feathers are very, very good at retaining warmth. There are also feathers like phytol plumes, semi-plumes, and bristles, which provide things like sensory functions. Some of these are on the feet of the birds or on the mouth, around the mouth, and they use them to feel around in water, or some birds fly at night and can feel insects hitting their face, and they use them for catching them. Semi-plumes are used for insulation and probably for aerodynamics as well. Color in birds is an interesting thing. Birds obviously have a variety of colors, and some of those are due to pigments that are in the bird's feather, but some are due to other factors that we'll talk about. If you look, for example, at the very nicely red cardinal, the northern cardinal, very red male bird, they actually are born sort of gray and are kind of a gray color until they get the carotenoids, which make them this bright red color. And they get those red carotenoids by eating berries from a dogwood tree, and they accumulate those colors, and those are probably used to attract mates. To have the brighter red color in many birds is significant for attracting females if you're a male bird. So those are due to a pigment, in this case carotenoids. Also carotenoids, flamingos, which would also tend to be sort of a grayish color, they are pink because they get carotenoids through the food chain. There's brine shrimp that they eat, and those brine shrimp are feeding on algae, and the algae have red and yellow carotenoids in them, and those colors combined give a flamingo its pink color. in zoos and places like that, they artificially will put carotenoids into the food. Otherwise, the birds don't stay pink. Your flamingos will turn sort of a grayish color, and everybody wants to see pink flamingos. But that has to come from the diet. So if you look at a bird like Anna's hummingbird, this is sort of a very different exception to that. In the case of Anna's hummingbird, they will have these minute little reflectors, and they reflect light back to your eye. So what you're seeing, this bright red color here, that's not the same as the carotenoids in the northern cardinal. When this bird turns, it'll look black in that same spot, because what it's doing instead is it's reflecting that bright red color, that iridescent red color from the sunlight back onto your eye. It doesn't actually have a pigment that color, but instead it's the structure of the feather that allows it to reflect that color of light back onto your eye. So instead of a diet, these birds will stay that color despite the diet, because they have structurally the feathers that are producing the color. Another thing that's interesting when you talk about birds is the concept of resource partitioning. So we'll find, for example, in shorebirds that there's this wide range of bill length. So they'll have different sizes of bill, long, short, and often they will use that in a particular way to eat a particular kind of food. So we call that resource partitioning, because different species have evolved to live in the same area, but to specialize in eating different things. When we talk about birds, there are many birds, 8,600 species, one of the biggest, next to fish. I think it's maybe the second largest of the group. Mammals might be close to that, but fish definitely wins in terms of vertebrates, and then birds is up there pretty close at around 8,600 species, 28 orders. You don't need to memorize the cladograms and the orders of all the different groups. Instead, what we're going to do is in lab, I'll go over lab later on, and I'll talk about the bird orders, and I'll tell you how that works in lab. But for lecture, I'm going to give you certain common orders that you need to know that I think are pretty straightforward, that you'll be good at. So first, we have the order Passeriformes, which is the biggest group by far. These are what we call songbirds. They have a complex syrinx, and the syrinx is a voice box, kind of like our larynx, where we can produce with our vocal cords different sounds. The syrinx is a set of throat structures that allow songbirds to produce. Their brain has learned, or they're born with, or some combination of those two, the ability to sing the song. But the syrinx allows the bird to sing the song structurally. It's like the instrument that is being used to produce the wide range of notes and chirps and those various things in a certain order to produce what we call the bird song. They have 3 toes that point forward and 1 that points back. That's how they grip onto like a telephone wire or that kind of thing. That back one is called the hallux, and it allows them to grip onto your fence or that kind of thing. Again, the biggest group of birds, and many birds fall into this group. The next group is the Anseriformes. These are ducks. Most people can look at a duck and know what a duck looks like. So that's a nice, easy one. They have 3-toed feet with webbing, and they have an unusually long neck and a flat bill. So again, a very duck-like looking structure. So that's normally something pretty easy to see. Most people know when they're looking at a duck. And one thing that's unique about ducks is they will molt their feathers all at one time, their flight feathers. So there's a period of time when a duck is essentially flightless as it's repairing its flight feathers and growing new ones. It will shed or molt those. So there are periods of time when ducks are unable to fly. They still have their regular feathers, but not their flight feathers, and that's a unique characteristic of the Anseriformes. Then we have the Columbiformes, which are pigeons and doves. This is a very heavy set, compact bird with broad, rounded, powerful wings, and they tend to have a short bill and legs and neck. So it's a very compact bird, but very powerful. So short, heavy, compact, and dense, but very powerful. So what's hard to do in flying, it's easy to not fly. Once you're flying, it's easy to fly fast if you have big, long, tapered wings. But what's hard to do is to have enough power to fly slowly. And that's what pigeons and doves are able to do. They have these big, powerful bodies, and they're able to fly slowly. And the advantage of being able to fly slowly is it allows you to navigate through branches and that kind of thing. So the advantage of flying slow is not something you see in most fairly large birds, which is the ability to navigate and fly through branches and that kind of thing. When you're going fast, it's hard to navigate through those. If you're a small bird, you can hop from branch to branch, but being a pretty big bird and flying slow don't go together very well unless you're something like a pigeon or dove. So it's kind of a unique body style for that. Then we have the Apodiformes, which are the hummingbirds. As the name sort of implies, Apodiformes, you would think they don't have any feet. When they were named, they thought the birds didn't have any feet, but they do have these little tiny feet. They're very tiny, almost useless feet. Most of them can't walk. And they use it really just to perch or that kind of thing. And hummingbirds are very, very small, obviously. And as being a very small animal, they have a very high metabolic rate. They have their heart rate up to around 1,200 beats per minute. Being very, very small and flying are two difficult things to do. So hummingbirds eat nectar as their main energy source, which is basically sugar. They'll eat insects and things like that for their protein, but they often are struggling for food. Their metabolic rates are so high that they're kind of always needing to eat. You can't just sort of go a couple days without eating very well if you're something like a hummingbird. Then we have the Falconiformes next. The Falconiformes are hawks, and vultures are now put into that group. They tend to have beaks with sharp hooks for tearing meat, and they have long curved claws called talons, and they use that to tear things apart. And then we have the Piciformes next. The Piciformes are woodpeckers, and woodpeckers have two toes that point forward and two that point backwards, and that allows them to move up and down the side of like a tree. That's where you often will see woodpeckers. Woodpeckers hit a tree or a stump or a log, and they tap on it looking for insects. And then they have this crazy tongue that goes around essentially their skull. It's really, really long, and they can push this tongue as they peck into, they can push that tongue in and pull things out that are deeper in the wood than into the telephone pole or tree than you would expect most animals to have in terms of a tongue. Okay, so that's it for birds. Our next group is mammals. We'll finish that up, and then we'll be moving on to anatomy and physiology, and then we'll be done for the semester.